And so he says, what are we going to do? If you're to avoid, on the one hand, what he calls the madhouse option, where everybody pursues self-fulfillment without any regard to social coherence, if you're going to avoid that on the one hand, and avoid, on the other hand, what he calls the totalitarian option, where the state imposes values on the masses, he says the only way out is to adopt some noble lie that will fool everybody into thinking that life really does have meaning and value and purpose, and so will compel us to live beyond self-interest and to live for these noble ideals, which in fact are actually false. And so in order to get along, he says, we basically have to live in self-deception.
It's a placebo effect.
Yes, that's right. And what's ironic about this to me, Kevin, is having read the great existentialist philosophers, this is the central sin for an existentialist philosopher, is to live an inauthentic life, a life of self-deception and inauthenticity. And yet this is exactly what Dr. Rue says we must do if we're to survive. We must adopt these noble lies that will deceive us into living beyond selfish interest and so forth.
You made a point in some of your writing on this that the more convinced you are that it's a placebo, the less it works.
Yeah, that's really the problem, isn't it? I mean, with a placebo, the reason it works is because the person who's taking it thinks, oh, this is really the cure. This is real medicine, when in fact it's just sugar water. And in the same way, the noble lie will only work on the person who thinks it's true. But what do you do with the people like Rue and us and others who know that it's a lie? Well, in their case, it won't work. So what this leads to is a sort of society where you have a kind of cultural elite, the intelligentsia, who know the truth, but deceive the masses in order for society to get along and be perpetuated. And it leads to this very sinister kind of 1984 society where you've got this government of the elites that basically deceive the masses for their own good to help them get along.
This also seems to be leading to the objection that we often hear on this, Bill, and that is, well, it doesn't matter if there is any ultimate meaning or objective meaning, just all that matters is that you have subjective meaning or temporary meaning. I can create my own meaning, and I like to play golf, and I'll play golf till I drop, kind of a thing.
Right. And that is what Rue says leads to the madhouse option. It leads to anarchy. The only reason it hasn't so far is because we live in a Western culture which has a vestige of Christianity, largely determining what people think to be right and wrong and so forth. And so we all kind of agree that it's good to love your neighbor and do things of that sort, and that it's wrong to be a psychopath and abuse children or cannibalize other people. But on atheism, as Dostoevsky said, there's nothing really wrong with those things. All things are permitted. And so if pursued seriously, it really would lead to anarchy.
What things are required then for life to have meaning?
Well, in this chapter, I argue that there are two basic requirements in order for life to be meaningful, valuable, and purposeful. And that would be God, and by that I mean the personal God of the great monotheistic faiths, and then immortality. There has to be life beyond the grave. Life cannot end in our physical death. So those would be, I think, the two necessary conditions for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life. And of course, if atheism is true, you've got neither of those conditions.
Now, if God were to exist, but we didn't survive the grave, that would still seem rather meaningless. We could serve him while we are alive, but then one of these days it's all going to be over and all for naught. That's why you're combining the two, it seems.
Yes, this is a very interesting question, Kevin, that you're raising. I think that the view you've described, namely you believe in God, but you don't believe in any life beyond the grave, that leads to the worldview of Ecclesiastes. Think of the book of Ecclesiastes. That author clearly believed in God, but so far as he's thinking there's no life beyond the grave, everything ends in death. And his verdict is, well, then it's all vanity. Pleasure, wealth, political fame, education, it all is ultimately meaningless because it just ends in the grave. So I do think that there is required more than just God's existence. I think that immortality as well is required.
Chase this with me for just a moment, Bill. It seems that if the Bible taught annihilationism, that eventually those who reject God and the unbelievers who die in the sin apart from Christ, if they knew that they were just going to be annihilated by God, well then it'll all be over anyway. There's no endurance. There's no eternal consciousness. And so go ahead and be nihilistic.
Yeah, that does seem to me to follow, Kevin. I think there has to be some kind of moral accountability in the afterlife as opposed to just being annihilated. I think that many atheists would be quite happy with that prospect. In fact, I know they would because they've said so. People like Aldous Huxley basically said, I don't believe in God because it allows me to do whatever I please. And when you die, the consequences end right there. So annihilationism, I don't think, would disturb those kind of folks at all.
You tell of a science fiction story that you once read about a man on a planet. That seemed to make sense, too, because this is the other side of the coin. Were you to live eternally, but there were no God or no ultimate purpose, well, then you're really stuck at that point.
Yeah, if there is no God, but your life just goes on forever, it would become absolute tedium. It would become horrible boredom. As one person has put it, even Shakespeare, even Beethoven, after a while, will become noxious and unbearable. And I think what this expresses is that only an infinite good can satisfy man's ultimate longings. Any finite good pursued long enough will ultimately become boring and even noxious after a while. It takes an infinite good to satisfy, I think, the human heart. And so we need both God as well as immortality if life is to be meaningful, valuable, and purposeful.
Dr. Craig, our question of the day, can the non-theist or the atheist be a moral person?
Well, I think that he certainly can because God exists. If there were no God, then none of us could be a moral person in the true sense of the word because morality would just be a human illusion. It would just be an ingrained behavior pattern that's the product of sociobiological evolution. But because there really is a God who is the standard of absolute right and wrong, good and evil, that means that the theist and the atheist alike can live lives that, to differing degrees, live up to those objective standards and therefore can be good.
A lot of non-Christians or non-theists get rather offended when they think that we're saying that moral values are grounded in God and so forth, and they say, you don't have to believe in God to be a good person. I'm a good person and I don't believe in God.
Right, they're misunderstanding the argument, and we need to be very clear when we offer a moral argument for God's existence that we're not claiming that belief in God is necessary for moral goodness to exist. We're claiming that God himself is necessary in order for moral goodness to exist.
When we apply Christian theology to that, we seem to take it to another step, and that would be, but our good works and our moral values are not what will get us in right relationship with God.
Exactly. If there are objective moral values that exist, then what this ought to produce in us in a deep sense of shame and guilt because it's so obvious that we fail to live up to that standard. C.S. Lewis put it very nicely when he said, no one knows how bad he is until he has really tried to be good.
For more resources on these and many other topics from Dr. William Lane Craig, visit online to reasonablefaith.com. That's reasonablefaith.com.